At 10, inflation hits its highest level for more than 40 years. The rising price of food like butter, milk and pasta, along with soaring energy bills, are the main things pushing up the cost of living even further.
It's like nothing adds up. I've never in my time here looked into the sort of abyss like it is now. It's just like, whatever we do, it's not going to be enough.
Tomorrow, the Chancellor will unveil his autumn statement, and I will have details on what it means for pensions, benefits and the cost of energy.
Also on the programme tonight, NATO says the missile strike in Poland was probably from Ukraine's air defence system, not fired by Russia. There's to be an independent investigation into the Deputy Prime Minister Dominic Raab after 2 formal complaints were made about his behaviour.
And liftoff of Artemis 1. We rise together, back to the moon and beyond.
And paving the way for man's return to the moon, NASA's moon mission finally blasts off.
On BBC London, we'll have details of a high-level row over the resignation of this lady earlier this year, and a modern take on Shakespeare with the help of an Oscar winner.
Good evening. Inflation has hit its highest level since 1981. Rising food costs and soaring energy bills have helped to push prices up by 11.1% in the year to October, from 10.1% in September. That's higher than expected. The figures come ahead of the Chancellor's autumn statement tomorrow, when he'll unveil a package of tax hikes and spending cuts. Our economics editor Faisal Islam is here with the details. Faisal.
Thanks, Sophie. The decades of relatively low inflation have ended. We're seeing the cost of living rising at rates not seen since 1981. Only in the late 1970s were they worse, when it was fueled by rocketing oil prices. It's more than 5 times now at 11%, the target of 2%. In fact, all of the inflation we normally expect over 1 year has come in just the 1 month. That has been driven by energy bills and also basic food prices, rising dramatically on last year. Margarine is up 42%. Pasta will cost you a third more than last October, whilst cheese is up more than 27%. And the Office for National Statistics says the poorest households will feel the impact of these hikes much more, as they spend much more on the basics. This now towers over tomorrow's autumn statement. More on that to come, but I've been to Gloucester to find out how people are being affected. At Knit and Natter in Cam in Gloucestershire, much of the nattering is about the rising price of everything, and especially energy.
Try not to put the tumble dryer on so much, although with this weather.
Yes. But how will people afford food and energy if...
I don't know. Yeah. They'll find a way. Did in the war.
Buying things is guesswork. So going shopping, it's you can't say, OK, I'm going to spend this amount and shop for the week.
It's quite hard to budget just because the prices have gone up so much. For Maureen, Doreen and friends, the intricate and delicate trade-offs of double-digit inflation also faced by the Chancellor and the Bank of England. Pensions are likely to go up in line with double-digit inflation rates, but the extent of the squeeze from energy and food prices clear from demand for subsidised food and meals at this local community hub.
In another month or two, when heating bills, when people switch their heating on, they're just going to have, there's nothing left to cushion the increases. I've never in my time here looked into the sort of abyss like it is now. It's just like, whatever we do, it's not going to be enough.
And some of those who came to this hub to volunteer, like Sarah, have had to use some of the services.
People are scared. I don't know anyone that uses the food pantry that has actually put their heating on. Really? And they're still struggling with their bills.
In nearby Dursley, a guitar retailer explains the reasons for price pressures.
We've seen prices go up by 25–30% due to raw material costs going up, transportation costs going up, energy prices going up, general inflation, of course. and we try to absorb that. We can only put 2 or 3%, maybe 5% on air prices to try and absorb some of those costs.
And that is the balancing act for the Bank of England.
Once we get through this winter, because of the way the gas price effects are going to work through this winter, that there should be quite a pronounced fall in inflation thereafter, and our forecast brings it back to target and actually takes it below target, actually to zero.
In Gloucester, at the indoor market, the inflationary juggernaut means traders can't really believe the prices they're having to charge.
We check our prices monthly as our stock's coming in because it's going up, and we're not even being told it's going up, it's just gone up on our invoices.
Even the cards where they used to be £1, then they've been £1.50 for the longest time, and now this year they've gone up to £1.99. So it's another 50p, you know. Yeah.
And yet there are signs of recession everywhere. So, while acknowledging post-election spending being cut and taxes going up, the government is more wary of turning off the taps of its support too quickly.
Well, Faisal is with me now. Let's look ahead to tomorrow's autumn statement. Tomorrow morning, a big moment for the government, a big moment for the Chancellor. What can we expect?
Kind of like a sort of budget of two halves in a way. The sort of grim predictions that we've been hearing, expectations managed for, I think they're mainly about what's going to happen after the election, after 2025, significant consolidation of the public finances. The pattern before that, in the next couple of years, I think is a little different. I pick up some concern in government circles about not making the recession that we may well have started already any worse. So to that end, we're going to get support. We're going to see inflation rises in the state pension in line with that famous triple lock, but also tax credits and benefits too, double-digit rise in line with September's inflation figure of 10%. Also the national living wage going up by that amount. That's my expectation. And then on top of that, the energy price rescue, the energy price guarantee, which was due to end in April, will survive in a form for all households, I think, beyond April now, but at a different level. So a slightly less generous level, which is consistent with energy bills going up from £2,500 for a typical household now to £3,000 for a typical household in April. So difficult, but it would have been worse had the support not gone on, would have been more like £4,000. So a lot more support. How do they pay for this? The big question. Some expectations in industry now of a significant increase in the windfall tax on energy companies as well. Significant measures expected tomorrow as the government wants to prove its fiscal credentials, but also protect the economy amid a likely recession. Our economics editor Faisal Islam, thank you. Well, the government hopes tomorrow's autumn statement will help the Bank of England's efforts to reduce inflation. Tax rises and big cuts to public spending are expected to be announced. Our social affairs correspondent Michael Buchanan looks at the impact of cuts to public spending in the last few years and how they might shape future decisions.
Previous spending cuts made poor communities poorer. Between 2010 and 2020, the average household wealth in the southeast of England increased by 42%. Here in the northeast, it rose just 3%. In Hordern in County Durham, hundreds of crumbling houses sit empty, attracting criminals.
This tap's a £29 tap. They'll get about 50p scrap off it, £1 scrap.
Well, they'll nick the tap.
But they'll take the tap, they'll take the sink.
Builder Ian Young says it's a struggle to renovate the properties.
The electrician came in, he rewired it over the weekend, been burgled again, all the cable had been pulled out. The kitchen refitted, that had been taken.
Ian said thieves had even stolen this window pane. The streets were due to be renovated years ago, but the plans were shelved when the government decided to charge social housing tenants with a spare room, the so-called bedroom tax. People no longer wanted to rent these homes as it would cost them. Residents now want the houses demolished but can't secure enough government funding.
Nationally, there is a housing shortage, and obviously we know that that's concentrated in the south of the country. We are being penalised for that because we have an overabundance of houses that are not fit for purpose anymore and really are not required anymore.
But you can't demolish them.
And we can't demolish them.
The North East was hit hard by public spending cuts. Life expectancy fell in some places, adding to the more than 300,000 excess deaths across Britain recently attributed to austerity by Glasgow University researchers. The past decade has seen Andrew James become a social worker as much as a head teacher.
Do you want to choose another one?
Child poverty in the North East is now the highest in Britain, having soared by nearly 50% in recent years. Andrew is having to use parish funds to buy some parents the absolute basics.
Provide electricity for families, pots and pans, so they can actually cook the food that they get from the food banks, providing wardrobes and clothes, so that the parents then do feel that their children are dressed appropriately to come into school.
And if you're too young for school, you might come to a baby bank. Before 2010, there were just a handful of these shops where parents can get all their baby needs for next to nothing. There are now over 200 baby banks in the UK.
I've been to homes where I've been providing clothing for children. I've arrived there and the children are playing with the junk mail because that's the only form of entertainment they have in their entire building. They have no toys or anything.
There has been government investment. This train station opened 2 years ago, costing over £10 million.
I don't think people would say that their communities have been left scarred by those spending reductions.
Despite the impact of previous cuts, North East MP and former Cabinet Minister Simon Clarke says the state can shrink further.
There is scope for spending to come down, and there's scope for it to come down without impacting on people's lives. The state has had to take too much of the strain precisely because the private sector hasn't been resilient enough, and so many people are therefore being disproportionately reliant on it.
The Chancellor says tomorrow's autumn statement will be fair and compassionate and will protect the most vulnerable. Those who've suffered the most after previous spending cuts will certainly hope so. Michael Buchanan, BBC News.
And if you want to find out more about tomorrow's autumn statement and how it may affect you, you can go to the BBC News website, bbc.co.uk/news, where there's a lot of information in our Cost of Living Tackling It Together series. NATO now says the missile that killed 2 people in eastern Poland yesterday was probably fired by Ukrainian air defences and not by Russia. Moscow had already strongly denied it was responsible for the rocket that hit a village near the border with Ukraine. In a moment, we'll hear from our international editor, Jeremy Bowen, with his assessment of the situation. But first, our Europe editor, Katya Adler, reports from Brussels, where NATO members have been meeting.
These have been nail-biting moments for Poland and its allies, gathering evidence and intelligence about last night's missile strike close to Poland's border with Ukraine. Yerevan lives nearby. His family heard the explosion, he said, and were really scared. NATO was also nervous. You'll notice almost more emphasis today on who likely wasn't behind the strike than who probably was.
We have no indication that this was the result of a deliberate attack. And we have no indication that Russia is preparing offensive military actions against NATO.
To Western leaders, immense relief. Poland's president says it seems the explosion was caused by Ukrainian air defense systems. An unfortunate error, he said. Moscow did pound Ukraine with missiles yesterday. If it had struck or targeted neighbouring NATO member Poland, as first suggested in Polish media, the whole alliance could have been called on, meaning confrontation with nuclear power Russia. NATO really wants to avoid that, while still supporting Ukraine's military. NATO leaders' carefully crafted, measured response today shows how much they fear Europe is on a knife edge. They've had a sharp shock reminder of the ever-present potential of Russia's war to escalate and spread beyond Ukraine's borders. Kiev sometimes accuses allies of getting too used to all those missiles raining down on its citizens. If that ever was the case, last night was a huge wake-up call. But it's also caused a rift with Kiev, determined Russia was behind the strike in Poland.
I have no doubt that this is not our missile, not our strike. I believe this is a Russian missile based on our military reports.
That's a very rare public break with his international allies. At a meeting of world leaders today, the Prime Minister assured Ukraine support against Russia was unwavering. And there were strong words from his foreign secretary.
The House should be in no doubt that the only reason why missiles are flying through European skies and exploding in European villages is because of Russia's barbaric invasion of Ukraine.
As the investigation continues on the ground in Poland, NATO says it's boosting air defences across Eastern Europe as well as Ukraine. Just in case. Katya Adler, BBC News, NATO.
Well, investigations are still ongoing. Our diplomatic correspondent Paul Adams has been taking a closer look at what happened on the border with Ukraine. Paul.
Sophie, as we've seen, the news of an explosion in Poland yesterday caused a shudder of fear throughout the Western alliance, especially in these Eastern European members of NATO, the ones in blue. Was this the moment everyone had been dreading since February, when NATO finally found itself in direct confrontation with Russia? Let's remember exactly what was happening yesterday, right on NATO's doorstep. Another day of massive Russian missile strikes against Ukraine's civilian infrastructure from one end of the country to the other. Some of those strikes were over in the very far west, close to the Polish border, very close to the village where those two people died. Ukraine said, and still says, that a Russian missile was responsible. Before long, though, experts looked at this wreckage and came up with a rather different theory, that these were parts of an air defense missile fired by Ukraine. World leaders from Joe Biden to the Polish president have all gradually come to the same conclusion. This is the S-300, a Russian-made surface-to-air missile, introduced in the 1970s and still widely used throughout the countries of the old Soviet Union, including Ukraine. As Russian cruise missiles flew across Ukrainian cities yesterday, there were frantic efforts to shoot them down. Many were successful, some were not. But Western leaders all agree on one thing, that Ukraine has the absolute right to defend itself. Whatever happened yesterday in Poland, they say it was not Ukraine's fault.
Paul, thank you. Well, our international editor, Jeremy Bowen, has spent the last month in Ukraine. He's just flown back tonight and straight into the studio. Jeremy, good to see you back. The missile that landed in Poland shows just how quickly this could escalate.
Yeah, a very fragile situation, as we've been hearing tonight. And as people were thinking yesterday, I think there was a real frisson of almost panic for a few hours, wondering if this was coming to pass, the thing that they dreaded most. I think one thing that is interesting, though, is the way that both NATO, led by America, and Russia deliberately did not escalate the rhetoric at all. NATO very measured, and Russia praising them afterwards, praising Biden by name for being measured. And this rift with Zelensky is interesting because, of course, for Zelensky, getting more NATO help for him means getting closer to victory.
You've spent the last 4 weeks in Ukraine. You've been travelling along the front line. You got into Kherson City. What is life like for people there at the moment?
Well, first off, Ukraine is a very big country. So you can go to some places which seem relatively normal in the way that they look. They're not damaged. If you go along that front line area, and I went from one end to the other, in those areas where there's fighting, where there's it's shelling rather than fighting a lot of the time, there's an enormous amount of destruction. A lot of people have left, not everybody, and life is very hard, very dangerous. You walk down the street, it's scary. You know, it's scary to drive down, just even for a short period. So there's that. But I think the impact of these missile attacks means that the pain and misery of the war spreads more across the country, because if you haven't got electricity and heating, and it takes power to pump water, and not having water is possibly the worst thing, worse than not having heating. So even in areas a long way from the front now, they felt all of that. It doesn't feel like there are missiles raining down the whole time because it's a big area, but that definitely hurts the way people live, and it's a common military tactic. The Russians aren't the first people to do this. The Americans did it in Iraq, because by putting pressure on the people, the idea is you put pressure on the government and make their lives more difficult.
Jeremy Bowen, thank you. The Deputy Prime Minister, Dominic Raab, is facing an investigation into 2 formal complaints about his behaviour. It's been claimed that Mr Raab bullied officials in his previous cabinet roles. Standing in for Rishi Sunak at Prime Minister's Questions this lunchtime, he said he wanted an independent inquiry as soon as possible to thoroughly rebut and refute the allegations. But for the moment, there isn't an ethics advisor to investigate alleged breaches of the ministerial code. The Prime Minister has yet to appoint a new one. Here's our Deputy Political Editor, Vicky Young.
Let's make him our next Prime Minister. Please welcome Rishi Sunak.
Close allies supporting each other in difficult times. Dominic Raab got his old job back when his friend became Prime Minister, but not everyone has welcomed his return. It's prompted allegations of past unacceptable behaviour towards staff. Just before he was due to stand in for the Prime Minister in the Commons, he revealed that 2 formal complaints had been made yesterday. In a letter to Mr Sunak, he said, "I am writing to request that you commission an independent investigation into the claims as soon as possible. I will cooperate fully." He went on, "I have never tolerated bullying and always sought to reinforce and empower the teams of civil servants in my departments."
Angela Rayner.
Labour's deputy leader said that didn't go far enough.
His letter contains no hint of admission or apology. This is anti-bullying. This is anti-bullying week. Will he apologise?
I'm confident I behaved professionally throughout, but of course I will engage thoroughly and look forward, Mr Speaker, may I say, look forward to transparently addressing any claims that have been made.
When Mr Raab was Foreign Secretary, his most senior civil servant says staff were scared to go into his office because he was curt and demeaning. Other officials have told me he was demanding and forceful, but didn't bully people. Senior civil servants are reluctant to come forward with complaints about ministers, according to the union that represents them.
There are no procedures here for how an investigation would be concluded. A civil servant doesn't know how it's going to be investigated. They have no right of challenge if they don't like the outcome of it.
And there's a reason why many don't have confidence in the current system. Under Boris Johnson, 2 ethics advisors resigned, feeling undermined and ignored. Downing Street says they're looking for a replacement, but the Prime Minister will still be the one who decides whether a minister has broken the rules.
Dominic Raab is staying in his job, hoping to clear his name soon. But for now, we don't know when the investigation will start or who'll be doing it. Vicky Young, BBC News, Westminster.
A look now at some other stories making the news today. Rail workers from the RMT union have voted in favour of holding more strikes. Staff at Network Rail and 14 train companies have agreed to continue industrial action for another 6 months. Rail operators said further strikes would be counterproductive and passengers would be dismayed by the outcome. The Oscar-winning actor Kevin Spacey is to be charged with a further 7 sexual offences. The Crown Prosecution Service says the new charges follow a review of evidence. They include 3 counts of indecent assault and 3 of sexual assault. The offences are alleged to have taken place between 2001 and 2004. The supermarkets Asda and Lidl have started to ration the number of boxes of eggs customers can buy due to supply issues. UK poultry farmers are facing rising costs and an outbreak of avian flu. It started to affect the supply of eggs and has also led to concerns of a shortage of Christmas turkeys. NASA's Artemis rocket is finally on its way to the moon, marking the start of a new era which will eventually see humans return to the moon. Technical hitches and 2 hurricanes prevented 2 previous launch attempts in recent weeks, but the rocket finally blasted off on its debut flight from Florida's Kennedy Space Center just before 7 o'clock this morning. Our science editor, Rebecca Morell, was watching.
And here we go. 5.
It was the moment they'd been waiting for.
3, 2, 1. And liftoff of Artemis 1.
After months of setbacks, NASA's most powerful rocket was finally on its way. The start of humanity's return to the moon.
We rise together, back to the moon and beyond.
It's an incredibly complex machine. It has so many components. To get 8.8 million pounds of thrust off the ground requires many systems that all have to work together perfectly. And it did just that today.
No people are on board this time, but this test flight will show if it's safe for astronauts. The ultimate plan is to land the first woman and first person of colour on the moon.
I wanted to be an astronaut from the time that I was 5 years old. And, for anybody that has a dream or some kind of aspiration, if they see somebody that they can identify with a little bit, it puts them into a totally different perspective where they can say, well, wait a minute, that person was just like me and they did it, so I can do it too.
And in a remote part of Cornwall, the Goonhilly Earth Station has an important role to play. This huge dish is part of a network of antennas around the world tracking the spacecraft, and the data it receives is vital. It will help NASA to work out exactly where the spacecraft is and how fast it's moving as it heads towards the moon. And here's the first signal sent back.
This doesn't look like very much, I think, to most people, but to communication engineers, this is pure magic. What you would normally see is just a flat line of noise, but we're picking up this signal from space, from the Artemis spacecraft.
With a last look back at the Earth, the spacecraft now has a 26-day journey ahead. This is just the beginning, the start of a 1 million-mile journey that's being described as Apollo for a new generation. Rebecca Morrell, BBC News.
The Men's Football World Cup kicks off on Sunday. The England squad have had their first training session today after arriving in Doha. The Wales team arrived late last night for what is their first World Cup since 1958. Their training starts tomorrow afternoon, with both teams playing their first games on Monday. In a moment, we'll hear from Hal Griffith on the mood in the Wales camp. But first, here's our sports correspondent Natalie Perks on England's preparations.
For some, it's a well-trodden path. For others, it's a brand new adventure. As England trained for the first time in the desert heat, dreams are being realised by those who are sweating on an important call.
Hoping for the best but preparing for the worst. I haven't been in the squad for 3 years and I'm not naive, I understand how it works and stuff, but I also had that hope. After the call finished and he had told me that I was in, it was a head on the wall moment, big deep breath and then called my parents.
These are new sights and sounds for a World Cup. It's estimated more than 1 million fans will descend on this tiny Gulf state over the next 4 weeks. But it's been a lot longer in the planning for England.
9 years ago, the FA boldly targeted winning this World Cup as the long-term goal. And Gareth Southgate has called on his players to embrace the opportunity to make history. But England have arrived here amid their worst run of form since 1958.
And Trippier will have the run and shot!
Their surprising run to the semis in Russia 4 years ago was followed with their first ever European final last year. But since then, they haven't won in 6 matches. But form is temporary. Attitude is everything.
There was a feel about the Euros and in Russia that the togetherness was all there for everyone to see. And coming back into the squad and meeting up, it's been the same sort of thing. And you can feel it, there's a real good energy in here. There's such a good group.
Qatari traditions and values have been thrust uncomfortably into the spotlight. Football will provide a welcome distraction for locals. But will this World Cup be where England make their move? Natalie Perks, BBC News, Doha.
Touchdown in Doha, a 64-year journey finally complete. For their first World Cup since 1958, Wales arrived excited, but not weighed down by expectation. There's not too much emotional baggage.
Yeah, of course we're proud and we're just glad now that we're here and we can throw full focus now into the first game.
After such a long wait, this isn't the World Cup most Welsh fans have been dreaming of. The cost of getting to Qatar, concern about human rights here mean many supporters will stay at home. On the pitch, Gareth Bale will wear a rainbow armband to show the team's opposition to discrimination and inequality.
All credit then to gallant Wales for...
There were political concerns back in 1958 too. Wales, qualified as other nations, refused to play Israel. They made it through to the quarter-finals. Cliff Jones was part of that team and reckons the current squad share the same spirit.
Very similar to the way when we went to the World Cup. People didn't give us much of a chance, but hey, we frightened everybody out there and it was just a special occasion.
This generation has succeeded on the European stage. In 2016, they reached the semi-finals of the Euros. But now the opposition is global. First up, the USA.
Yeah, I guess in a way, whoever wins, I'll be happy. So
Megan is an American who writes about Welsh football. What does she expect?
Wales are going into this without any pressure. And because of that, I think Wales are actually in better stead than most of these other teams. For example, the US, there's a lot of pressure on them right now to get out of that group stage.
We'll find out when they play on Monday. For now, Wales are just sizing up the task ahead and acclimatising to an altogether different World Cup. Hywel Griffith, BBC News, Doha.
We'll have the weather in a moment, but this is what's happening here in Broadcasting House tonight. This is the BBC's Radio Theatre, where Radio 2's Scott Mills is walking, jogging, even running for a whole 24 hours on a treadmill to raise money for children in need. He started at 8:30 this morning and he's hurting. A long night ahead for him, but he has already raised nearly £300,000. Good effort. Time now for a look at the weather. Here's Stav.
Thanks very much, Sophie. Good evening to you. It's been a thoroughly wet evening across southern Britain. New area of low pressure has been sweeping in. It's going to hang around for the next few days. The same area of low pressure, both Thursday and Friday, wet and windy for many northern and eastern parts of the country. If I run the sequence through tonight and then into Thursday, Friday, you can see how it pretty much stalls across the UK, weakening gradually, but it's going to bring a lot of rain across parts of the north and the east of the UK. So we have a few weather warnings in force. Could see some localised flooding by the time Friday's out. Heavy rain's been sweeping into southern areas over the last few hours. Some rumbles of thunder too. Rain pushing into eastern Scotland. A little bit of snow over the high ground there as well. And the winds will be a feature as this low pushes northeastwards through the channel. Gusts at 60, maybe 70 miles an hour over the next few hours. And very windy as well across North Sea coast, in particular across the Northern Isles, up to 70 miles an hour there. So where we have the cloud, the wind and the rain, temperatures no lower than 6 to 9 degrees. But out west, Western Scotland, Northern Ireland and the clear skies, a cold night to come for you with some frost and fog. But here it'll be bright through the morning. Elsewhere tomorrow is a pretty atrocious day. Rain piling into eastern Scotland, northern, eastern England, North Wales through the Midlands. Strong winds as well. So a pretty dismal afternoon there. Temperatures 9 to 11 degrees. Best of the sunshine towards the south and the west corner of the UK. Friday, spot the difference, not much change. We've got that area of low pressure bringing wet, windy weather to the northern half of the country. Probably the best of any brighter weather towards the south and the west. Again, a few showers rattling through and a cold northwesterly wind. Temperatures 9 to 12 degrees. So a pretty cool and wet windy few days coming up. A little bit quiet into the start of the weekend. Next band of rain spreads through with some strong winds, and that'll be followed by sunshine and showers on Sunday. That's it for me. Back to you, Sophie.
Stav, thank you. And that's the BBC News at 10 on Wednesday, the 16th of November. There is plenty more analysis of today's main stories on Newsnight. There's Kirsty Walk just about to get underway on BBC Two. The news, however, continues here on BBC One. It's time to join our colleagues across the nations and regions for the news where you are. Good night.